Hi everyone, I will be your discussion leader for the last week of class. This week we had two readings. The first one was the last chapter in Nito's book. The theme that I got from the chapter was about possible or probable problems teachers will face over the course of their career and things we as teachers need to consider when joining a school. The second reading was an article by Bartolome, a name I will absolutely butcher. And I got a few things out of this one, but the major one was about ideologies and how we as teachers need to assess and address them. I will also talk about additional things to the Nito chapter that teachers need to consider from the article. I would like to say up front that this was quite difficult but interesting for me as I am part of the dominant mainstream culture. So a lot of this was also analyzing myself and a lot of the potential problems I would have potentially brought into the classroom. I found the idea of I used to think, now I think really interesting, and it was a theme that kept coming back to me while reading through it. The concept that teachers can change the world is something I think many have and is definitely something that got me interested in teaching. However, Nito mentions that due to the many circumstances like social economic status and institutional racism that can be placed on everyone involved with education, many people, including students, become jaded with the system. There are some things that are essential for teachers to bring into the classroom to help combat the inequalities that will affect many schools in the US. Teachers need to create and maintain a high standard and expectations for their students and shouldn't try to be colorblind, but instead they and the student should bring every part of their identity to the classroom. Teachers should also seek and encourage parental involvement in every aspect of the student's education as much as possible. Political and ideological clarity was something that Bartolome stressed immediately because they insist that teaching is in no way politically or ideologically neutral. And now, with a large population of minority students, including low-income, non-white, and language minority, who are in the public schools, there are a number of differences between the average teacher and the average student who attends a diverse school. I've listed the differences here as teachers are majority white, come from a lower middle class or middle class background, and can't speak a second language. While one-third or around one-third of the student body in our nation is made up of minority children and a large portion of the African American and Latino kids live in poverty. There is also a tremendous number of students who aren't native English speakers. The author really stresses the dominant ideology, which comes from the white mainstream culture. They talk about the American ideology of individualism and how this affects many current and prospective teachers who may think in the same manner as this ideology and the problems it creates for minority and especially African American and Latino students because of the acceptance of the current educational system. The study the author focuses on looked at a school they refer to as Riverview High School, which had a largely Latino student body but was also quite diverse, and four educators who worked within that school. I've listed the pseudonyms for each educator in the slide. Each one to me embodied an individual theme which I will talk about later. There were some things that each instructor had in common, and they all defined student success in three terms. Academic success, like passing classes and being accepted into a university or college. Integration into the high school, where they could feel comfortable in that they belonged there, and obtaining life skills to confidently navigate daily life. Characteristics each of the four educators shared was that they critically analyzed themselves and the other personnel around them to create the best environment for their students to achieve success. and rejected the status quo of education and society. They also went beyond the classroom to help students and acknowledge that personal merit and ability alone won't cut it in the outside world, at least not yet. The first person the article focused on was named Mr. Broadbent, a math teacher, and to me, he embodied exposure. He emphasized that the students need to be exposed to the lives of people outside of their community, but didn't want his students to assimilate into the mainstream culture, while at the same time he acknowledged and celebrated the differences of his students. Next was Mrs. Cortland, an English teacher, who really stressed social economic status and the problems it creates for her students. Uh, Dr. Peabody was an administrator, and while she talked a lot about racism, the thing that stood out to me most was the idea of policing the staff and looking out for potential ideological issues that teachers might come with or develop over their tenure. The last one I'll talk about is Mr. Tijerina, also an English teacher, who mainly focused on racism in its many forms, and particularly focused on the racist perspectives about Mexicano and Latino students. There were some really important ideas for educators to consider and keep in mind that each person in the study talked about. Don't keep any secrets from students and be as transparent as possible with them. Be explicit with your expectations for your students in the classroom. And at the same time, be completely open and sincere with them, while also trying to be encouraging. It's also a good idea to go over things like grading requirements and processes like applying for a university to demystify that process, while also maintaining the merit of the minority students' own culture and critically analyzing mainstream culture and the inequalities of education in society. To help teachers with this, we can do things like learn a second language to better identify with our students and try to experience the life of a teacher and a student in low income and culturally diverse schools, in what the author called a border crossing experience. Sadly, for a lot of teachers, the responsibility is placed on each individual to practice and learn about the concepts covered in the text, as most teachers will be left by themselves. We should also try to experience and examine counterculture and always question the status quo of not only our individual settings, but education and society as a whole. A good idea for teacher training is to try and relate oppressive stories in white history and culture to minority cultural stories, so teachers can get a better idea of the problems their students may face. Never become complacent in the system, and always try to be courageous, not only for yourself, but most importantly for your students. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope I was able to bring a little something extra to the information in the text that we all read. I look forward to talking with each of you in the discussion. I hope you all had a good semester. I know I learned a lot. Last week,